All right, thank you, and welcome to our fourth discussion for the 2022 TOK prompts. This week we're doing prompt number 4, how do historians and human scientists give knowledge meaning through the telling of stories, discussed with references to history and human sciences. Today to discuss this topic we have 2 teachers and 2 students from EF Academy. We have Ms. Frizon, our TOK and geography teacher, also with a history background, which is notable for today. We have Alice Stairsey, one of our seniors. We have Max, another senior, and we have Mr. Park, an English teacher and Dean of Academics. Welcome, everybody. So, in discussing this topic, there's lots of ways we could break down the question itself, but I think I wanted to focus in on the TOK-ness of this question, where there's potentially 5 different areas of knowledge that you can talk about, but this question about stories, the IB has directed students directly to talk about history and human sciences in regards to stories. Ms. Frizon, we'll start with you. Why do you think IB would want students to focus just on history and human sciences when we talk about stories and meaning?
Sure. So when thinking about history, there is an element of storytelling that does take place. And when you think about stories, they conjure up a meaning, knowledge, and it places a context. So in terms of history, you need that context in order to fully appreciate and understand the meaning. And I feel like the same is true with the human sciences. As human beings, we are accustomed to telling stories, whether that's in psychology or geography. So you can place them together, where history can be part of the human sciences, but I think it makes a point to distinguish the two to really fully understand the context and the meaning behind the stories for each.
I think, personally, I think I completely agree. The thing is, humans have a very, very deep tie to both stories and meaning. So meaning is, because we tend to think with morality, I think meaning is something that we appreciate a lot and has this sort of ethical connotation to it. And I think we, even in our mere use of language, it's always storytelling. We need a person, an action, a place, an hour. We need specific context in order to communicate with each other. I think storytelling and meaning are 2 crucial and essential parts of human reasoning.
And also, as you said, there's the communication part of it that you mentioned. The history and human sciences need this communication where there's and stories also need the. Actually, one thing that came to my mind first when this question popped up is that in Italian and Spanish, the word storia, or history, or historia in Spanish would be the same word as history, because in part it's just one big story. It is a connection between many people and the stories they tell in between them, what happens, different perspectives. There's in general just a lot of communication in between them.
And I think too, if you want to understand human development, whether it be at a macro level or even myopically, it's important to strike a balance between the two. So I think you have to study the data, which might represent large scale movement or development, but then also to understand truly sort of the nature of that data, you could drill down to an individual or a group of individuals and get tight and see how did that big movement impact a singular person. It also could happen the other way too, where a singular person can impact the whole movement. I think it probably happens more in the former case than the latter, but to truly understand developments in history or developments in anthropology, I think you have to look at, sort of tidal changes and how those tidal changes impact, individuals or small groups of individuals. I think that's really important to have a broad picture of what you're studying.
I don't think I completely agree with what Max said, though. You said history is one big story. As a great history enthusiast, I don't think that, personally, I don't think that storytelling plays the biggest part in history. There is this distinction in history between, especially when you write about it, between writing narrative and writing analytical. And one thing that is very, very, very highlighted in IB History HL that I take is that writing narrative won't really give any meaning to what you're writing. Giving a simple story won't really convey the message. It's more about analyzing the story. It's more about taking concepts that the story can give to you and evaluating them and finding a bigger significance to the simple event, which no matter how much the words history and story resemble each other, I genuinely don't believe that storytelling plays a big part.
Well, I want to add to that too. I think that what you need to do, and I think this is when it gets dangerous, is when you're only looking at one party's story, especially when you're analyzing it. To your point, the challenge is to make sure that you're not, one-sided or biased when you're looking at the event, so that you're trying to look at as many different perspectives and players in that event as possible, and seeing the impact or the effect that the event had on each of those individual groups, and then using that to I think you're right, to extrapolate and say, oh, okay, so let me give as objective a viewpoint as this period of time or this development in human history that we're talking about by looking at all the different perspectives. So I think it has to be a balance. I don't think you can ignore the stories, but I think you're right. If you just zone in and you say, if you look at one, some significant event through exclusively one lens, then I think you're right. I think that's pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think we see examples of that in the political realm all the time.
Greek historians had to deal with the same dilemma. Do you incorporate the gods, in these stories, or is it strictly an objective, story? So, that's something that's been debated on for thousands of years.
Well, on that point, I want to jump in a bit, and let's break down the question a little bit. What every student should be doing as they approach this topic is they should be looking at two of the key terms in this question. One of them being stories, one of them being meaning. Let's start with story, because it's really the topic we're on right now. What is a story? What makes something a story versus a list of facts, let's say, for example?
Well, actually, I was gonna say that I agree with all you guys' points, because even though I know the point is to what you started saying is to disprove me, but I, at least in my opinion, I feel like stories have this piece of to convey a story, to portray a story, you need to have a message. You need to have a point. If you wanna tell something, you don't just, as you said it, you don't just narrate it. You don't just say something. You need to have a pull, is something that takes you there, that a meaning, a reason.
Yeah, because I think you're talking about the distinction, which we've done in creative writing class, between a story and an anecdote. So I think here we're talking, they're specifically talking about stories and anecdote. An anecdote could simply be a snapshot in time, and you can still, I think, get really important and valuable information from that. But if they're talking truly in this question about stories, I think Max is onto something here. The idea that there is a purpose, you have a distinct, the storyteller has a distinct purpose for telling the story that they're trying to communicate to a specific audience. And then you look at, well, how is that storyteller, what rhetorical choices is that storyteller making to connect those two? I think that's pretty important. And if you can't find those elements, then perhaps it's not a very valuable story to analyze and study.
And that you use the word purpose is also really interesting, because when we, for example, analyze a source in history, then one of the main things that we want to look at as the purpose.
Yeah.
It's a very, very essential part of a source. It could be anything. It could be a book, it could be a speech. But I think, to be honest, I had the completely opposite view. I thought, and now I'm actually starting to change my mind because of what you two argued, but I thought of a story as anything, a sentence. I had an apple for breakfast. I thought of that as a story. So that's where I saw how present storytelling is in human existence, because we tell a story every time we formulate a sentence. I'm telling a story right now, but then if we make this distinction that I think is a really interesting distinction between story and anecdote, then maybe it's not as present as we think it is.
But even to use your example, it depends on the context in which that story's placed. So, for example, if you're someone who says, I had an apple for breakfast, and we go, oh man, that's really important, because now the fact that she can have an apple relates to the fact that this trade route was opened up, and that's not a native fruit to the area, versus it is native and you just said an apple, well, you're right, then it doesn't have as much meaning. So it depends. A story doesn't necessarily have to be long for distinguish it from an anecdote. But I do think you're right, the purpose. And then you also have to dig into what is the purpose of the storyteller beyond just the message of the story. So is this some sort of propaganda? Are they were they paid to represent one perspective to try to influence people? Then you have to question that. And so it's like an onion. You just keep peeling it back.
To try and to just kind of, I want to rein it in a little bit. I want to be a little pedantic about this. What would we say our definition of a story would be then? A blank, a thing that has a purpose? Like, how else would we define story? What else makes a story a story?
One thing that I would say is that the story is a medium, as tying all of us points would be saying that it's a medium of communication that has a pull and a message that will that is based or is contexted on a certain knowledge claim or historical event that has happened in the past or is projected to be in the future. I don't know, maybe you guys want to add something, or...
I mean, storytelling, since the beginning of time has, when you think about all of the early civilizations, they would pass down stories through oral tradition.
Yeah.
And so there's that element of imagination. There's that element of memory as well, and stories tend to be something that resonate with us and stay with us, and are very easily passed on from generation to generation.
Well, that's an interesting point too. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, can you have a story without an audience?
Yeah.
If there's no audience to receive the story, is it a story?
I don't know.
That's...
Well,
I mean, typically an
need
author
an
of a
audience.
story, whether it's written or oral, has an intended audience.
Right.
Whether that audience is always the recipient of the story, I think, is another situation.
Well, this gets to the point I want to get to about what it means to give something meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe this is where we might want to delve into the idea of subjectivity in meaning. The subject being the audience that interacts with whatever medium of communication is given to them. Is that what a story is, and is that what this question is getting at, making meaning? Like, how do stories, whatever we're defining them as mediums that have a purpose and an audience, how do they then give meaning to any kind of knowledge?
Well, I think stories help humanize knowledge.
Okay.
And oftentimes, because we are human, that ends up having, touching us, or touching our soul to a greater extent, and therefore, I think we then grapple with that. I mean, I think that, take the oral story traditions of Native Americans, for example, or indigenous people. They could just say, don't do this, or this will happen. But instead, they find it to be a much more effective vehicle to tell a story, because oftentimes if children are the intended audience, for example, that's something that because of they're entertained by it, and then perhaps they're scared by it or moved by it in some way, then they're going to retain that knowledge more. And so it becomes, I don't know if it has more meaning, but it becomes in some way a more powerful vehicle to communicate that meaning and then have it continue to move forward because it's some sort of meaning that culture or society has decided is key to their survival or improvement or
That's
what have you.
the lesson behind the parables, right? You
Yeah.
have parables, there's something to be learned
Yeah.
from it, so. But going back to knowledge, you know, when we're telling stories, is the point to portray knowledge or to gain knowledge? Or is it strictly, you know, for, I guess, a pleasure? You know, is there something that needs to be gained through the story? Some type of knowledge that is found through a story?
You could say that also certain claims or certain statements, certain ideas can be contested through stories. Like we don't necessarily need to apply an idea for it to be tested. For example, let's think of different political or economical ideas such as capitalism and communism, where we can easily model each of them being in a perfect scenario, or we can tell a story for saying how it would look like in real life. And for example, I know this example of for example, there's this classroom. So it's trying to depict how communism works. So it's they give a test, and they give all the class the best grade, and with this grade, people say, okay, I'm getting good grades, so I'm not going to work. And that is obviously that is a really like speculative scenario, but then you realize how like in very simple terms applied ideas that are so complicated and so like in depth, such as economic ideals, can be just represented by measles stories.
I'd argue that telling stories is a way of drawing analogies.
Yeah.
And drawing analogies could arguably be a very, very big part in knowledge and understanding of things. Because we learn, well, this is my personal thought, we learn through patterns.
Yeah.
And actually this has been tested. What do you do to teach a dog certain things? You just keep repeating it, right?
Yeah.
We learn through patterns. History is arguably a big pattern.
They always say
a giant pattern keeps repeating itself. There's this Greek historian. I don't remember his name at all, but he came up with this concept of analogies in Greek, and it meant basically that history was a circle, and it just kept repeating itself, right? And I feel like that's how human reasoning works. We learn through analogy, we learn through patterns, and a way to demonstrate these patterns is the telling of stories, because it's drawing analogies, and it also gives better knowledge, because a story is even, again, it's even linguistically speaking the way that we communicate.
Yeah.
So that's also the way we learn, right? And we acquire knowledge like that. So I think it could have different, it could be important in many different ways.
Yeah, I think to go back to this point too is the idea that, you know, is it for pleasure or is it for knowledge? Is there a distinction? I mean, I think sometimes you make the distinction between, if all stories have some sort of purpose, some storytellers just happen to be more gifted at sharing that purpose than others. So, you know, if you take, Shakespeare, who's arguably the greatest writer in the English language, why do we continue to read him 500-600 years later? Because he was really good at encapsulating the main themes of the human condition and the human experience. So if you look at human sciences particularly, that's what he was so gifted at doing. Like C.S. Lewis said, another person who probably loved this question, we read so we know we're not alone, right? And that's what Shakespeare is good at. He hits so well and so poetically on the big themes of life that you read him and go, oh, okay, these things existed. And then if you start comparing stories across cultures and among cultures, then you see, oh, well, they were dealing with the same stuff that we're dealing with. So when you look at anthropology or sociology, you go, well, here are the connections that you can make among cultures, because these are the fundamental elements with which we consume ourselves as humans.
Right. It goes
So
back to our humanity.
yeah, so whether it be, Homer or Shakespeare, they're talking about the same fundamental stuff, because that's what seems to, for better or worse, consume us as people, right? And so, and if once you understand those, then you can, and how different cultures and societies respond to those major themes, that's a huge piece of understanding, like the anthropology, that's a huge piece of understanding people and why then historical movements or progression or lack of progression, according to what we consider progression, occurred.
Yeah, it's I feel like it's also, storytelling is also it's also I think we already said this, but it's also a way of giving a context to a much larger concept. It's a way of showing how a concept that is so abstract and just probably not that easy to grasp, to understand, is actually applicable to applicable.
No, applicable. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm not a native speaker, but to human existence. Philosophers use myths and stories all the time to explain their philosophy. So I'm writing my extended essay on a myth by Plato, the myth of the cave. He basically narrates about a cave and gives a scenario and gives an entire story. It's pretty long to explain a final concept. And I personally don't know if I would have understood it otherwise.
Yeah.
And because of that story, I actually was able to apply it to other situations that I see. I started comparing it with governments. I started comparing it with other things that I study, and I thought that was awesome.
I think that is a great point you just made, is the idea that sometimes we can't wrap our head. If you study those topics through like data, pure data, you're right, sometimes we can't wrap our heads around the sheer volume, perhaps. Like when you were saying that, I immediately thought, they talk about the number of people who were killed in the Holocaust. And it's difficult for me to understand what that really meant. But then you watch Schindler's List, or you read Night, and you go, oh,
Yeah.
I understand each one of those. Then you look at the number, the huge number. I don't know what it is. I don't want to misquote it. But you look at the number and you go, oh yeah, each one of those people was an individual life, and it impacted and affected each community that those people came from, and each family, and each town. And then you start understanding, and then you can go out, and then you suddenly arrive at that huge number. And you're right, it has a much more, the meaning then becomes greater. Yeah.
I think that's amazing. Actually, I immediately thought about, I'm very obsessed with ethics and morality, but I thought that maybe storytelling is also what adds that element of morality to concepts, adds that element of human values that are, for some people universal, for some people relative. That depends on the points of view, I guess, but it kind of adds that.
You can say it as concepts as simple as fables, of things that teach you a lesson of how to behave in your everyday life, and how you should see others and see yourself ethically, and live in a society with simple stories, simple scenarios of characters that probably never existed.
I'm going to jump in there. It's a great discussion, and I just want to sort of summarize where we've been so far. We've broken down what a story is by saying it's a kind of medium of communication that has a audience and a purpose or a message of some kind. And then in looking at the way stories imbue meaning into knowledge, we've said that it uses analogies to give people meaning. It takes complex ideas and simplifies them in a way that has context that people can understand. It humanizes them, and it can give ethical principles. And I think those are all ways we could analyze the way that knowledge stories give knowledge in these areas of knowledge meaning. So I want to move to these specific areas of knowledge now while we have some time. Specifically, let's start with history. To start with history, I actually want to just push back on something that Alice said earlier about how story isn't a big part of history, where if you're doing an IB essay, for example, in history class, you are not really supposed to do narrative. I would push back and say that is more analyzing history versus writing history. All right, you're not, as an IB student, you're not making history, right?
Right.
So as a historian, I don't think we should confuse the two things. So as a historian who is writing history in a university or whatnot, and they're trained to do it, narrative history is a form of history that often gets done, like that they tell us a long story. Now, this doesn't say that that's the only way to give meaning, but it does ask, how does the telling of stories give meaning? So in a historical narrative context where a historian is just telling a story, why or how does that story give meaning in a historical context?
I think it provides us with an essential part of history, which is connectivity, first of all. Connectivity is absolutely crucial in history. It's both the causes and the effects and the significance of an event. And I think significance is, again, a very important word in pretty much any area of knowledge, but in history especially, you want to know the significance of an event. You want to know the significance of a certain character, the impact that it had. You don't really care about where he was born or what he did. But I think storytelling gives that sort of element of connection between events, which ultimately is what creates history.
I'm sort of stuck on, historians and human scientists, how they give knowledge meaning. Well, these are people, right? They're humans. They can make errors, and we're putting so much power in their hands that they are controlling the narrative, the story. So you said something like, I don't want to know. I personally want to know who is the person writing. What is their background, and how is it that they are the ones that are given this authority, and is their meaning of knowledge correct?
Yeah, and that's what I was saying before.
Sorry.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that's why you have to study in literature classes. You do this all the time. You study the history of the writer,
Right.
to see how that history influenced. I mean, and then you have to study the period in which that person was writing and the influences, and it's sort of, I mean, really, you can go down the rabbit hole because it never ends.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I mean, that's crucial, and that's the danger of any educational system. We often study history through particular lenses, and then you see people get really upset when someone says, hey, we should consider adding another element. And that's happened very recently in the news, right? It's suddenly like, maybe we should consider the African American perspective more in history class. And people all up in arms because they don't want to change the narrative that puts them, in the right or in the wrong or whatever.
A great real life situation as an example, by the way, you TOK writers.
Yeah, so that happens, and then but I think that's the critical point you need to get to when you're studying something is
Absolutely.
you need to be able to get to the point where you go, well, wait a minute, let's question what is it that we're studying. This is important, good stuff, but what influenced it, and who are we leaving out of this discussion? Whose point of view or whose stories are we leaving out? Because I think that's where you start to find the intersection. I think that's where, if there is such thing as truth, that's where it often lies, is where all the stories sort of get woven together. It's hard to get there.
But then if you have this converging point between all these stories, you lose all the purpose, because then you have narrative. That's because undoubtedly, if you're trying to write a story based on something, you're gonna have to leave out some things, and you're gonna have to give more power to the things that your argument agrees with. And that's why I feel like that example was really good, because it just kind of gives the idea of
Sorry, what example?
the example of African American perspective.
Oh, right.
That gives the perspective of like, this is the story of our country, and we're giving the perspective from the perspective that we want them to see, other than the perspective of like a more general narrative based that the intent doesn't have to be a good intent. That's something that I want to clarify right away. It's not an intent that is like, oh, we want to leave these people's perspectives out, but it's more of a, we want to look good, and we want to look like this is a story of heroes rather than a story that is more complicated and like not heavy.
Could this possibly draw actually a limitation in storytelling? We considered a lot of values, but we didn't really consider limitations, which are also to consider, right?
Yeah.
So storytelling implies that there is an audience, but there's also a teller, and no matter how knowledgeable we are, we humans have this terrible thing where we're always biased.
Yeah.
It's very hard for a human not to be biased, or not to be subjective somehow. So the fact that storytelling implies a storyteller, the fact that history implies an historian behind it, that could also be a very big limitation. Because if it was only analysis of objective facts, then perhaps...
with every fact, there are alternative facts.
Yeah, exactly.
And then again, you cannot go knocking into every person's door saying, oh, hey, what's your perspective on this? Because some people may not even have one.
That kind of drops me to where I wanted to actually finish our conversation, but it's worth bringing up now to this point. Is this question implying that knowledge without a story or without meaning is more objective? That there's like this information or knowledge out there independent of a teller or an audience, but as soon as you imbue it with a story, as soon as you imbue it with some kind of meaning, that it becomes automatically subjective? Is this an objective subjective question in disguise?
I mean, it's so many. We're talking a lot about semantics now. It becomes super complicated because, if I think about a statistician, I don't normally think of a statistician as a storyteller.
Right.
Yeah.
But they have many of the same biases that Alice is talking about in terms of what they're going to report, how they're going to interpret the data, what data they're going to present, what data they're going to leave out. I'm not sure, how do you communicate knowledge in a purely objective way? I'm not sure that's possible. So as a result, I mean, in some ways, any study of human science or history has that person who's shaping it, manipulating it. And I think especially when you start looking at history that is before what we sort of consider contemporary history, then it becomes even more challenging because you might not have access, or you have to be really crafty with the way you access information beyond the storytellers who were empowered by the leaders or the people who were empowered at that time to tell a particular story, because controlling the narrative, it gives you control, period. And so, if you're looking at, ancient Rome, it might be more challenging than if you're looking at, 20th century United States history, because we still have access to different voices. I think, just because of the development of media and more people becoming literate and people, in art, where it can be more challenging when the only people who are able to produce were people who were directly empowered by, the government.
Yeah, which is also a thing that is very recurrent. And when you study ancient history, ancient literature, I studied ancient Greek and ancient Latin for 3 years. And it's always a very big question mark. There's not that element of certainty that there is with more, much more recent history or much more recent literature. It's that, so this poem narrates about this emperor's government, but we don't really know if it was actually like that, to the point that you don't really know if the names are actually accurate even. You don't even know if some authors existed. Homer, we don't know if he even existed. We don't even know if he was a person. So that is pretty relevant, I think. And also the fact that the word meaning, I give the word meaning a very moral connotation. I think meaning is something that is purely important to us humans on a moral level, like just like truth.
Yeah.
So I think in the moment where we have a word like meaning, which has such an important moral connotation, we also have relativity and subjectivity depending on what our personal morals are.
Yeah, and a couple points there that I think are really good is the further back you go from the 20th century to ancient history, the more the line between literature and history gets very blurred, right? It almost becomes synonymous, which is a good point. I think the other point there of meaning, I do want to harp on this a little bit, almost from an English perspective, right? That the postmodern sort of perspective of like, a book doesn't have meaning until it's read, right? Like the reader brings something to it. And I think that might be worth considering as we think about this as well. One thing that Mr. Park also brought up was the idea of a statistician, which I think we often might think of as math as an area of knowledge, but I do think we can use statistics in this analysis from economics or whatever else. So that brings me to my next question of what kind of stories do human scientists tell? Like, I think it's pretty obvious the kind of stories historians tell, but what kind of stories do you get in geography, economics, psychology, anthropology, and so on?
Again, just coming back to the points that I was making before, is more of a justification or an application of an idea, or in the case of geography, maybe I'm wrong, but how a place came up to be that way. Like, why is a country landlocked, for example? Like, let's think of the case of Bolivia in the Pacific War. That would be a little bit more history, but still, like how due to a treaty they became a landlocked country, and you can explain that through the lens of geography as well as the lens of history, while still giving that a meaning. You can also, no, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, you can.
Did I interrupt you? Okay.
No.
I don't think storytelling is necessarily a context or a situation, because storytelling could also be something that simply evolves, something that isn't static, something that is dynamic. Storytelling could be, in the case of economy, I know nothing about economy and I suck at math, but if it was data that keeps changing, would that be considerable as a story of simple? It's simply something that is dynamic. It's a story of simple change. There isn't. There is definitely a meaning in it, because there's a meaning in any change that we give to it, but there isn't really that much of a context, and perhaps the context isn't even needed.
But what if you're thinking about like climate change and rising sea levels?
Right.
It's important, I think, and I hope, it's important to understand the story of what led us to this point, if we have any hope of reversing it or trying to stem it, right? So is it important, like that would be rising sea levels, would that fall under geography?
Well, even there, the story remains the same, but it's the vocabulary that changes. So, you said climate change. 15 years ago it was global warming. In geography, we're learning about first world countries, right? That was the terminology 30 years ago. Then it became more economically developed countries. And now the terminology is high income countries, right? So the story can stay the same and the lesson can stay the same, but the terminology and the vocabulary can also evolve.
Which I think goes back to some of that, the change you just mentioned goes back to what Alice is saying about the morality of the situation, and people saying, oh, that's a loaded term that we recognize now. That's putting a judgment on people or exploiting people or not valuing their worth because of economic factors. I was thinking more along the lines of, like you were saying, like the data of purely like the sea level rise or the temperature rise in us going, well, we better understand the story of this, of how we got to this point,
Gotcha.
or we're going to sort of be victims of our inability to understand the story. Because right now we can read that story and go, oh, we're not going to like the climax of the story and the falling action of sort of where it's going to end up and the resolution. So if we don't understand the rising action, we're going to end up in a place that we're not that happy with.
Yeah. Another link that you can make to just another example of thinking about the economic perspective would be to justify things like in the stock market, such as the values of things such as Bitcoin, how they came up to be, which story they because in reality it's just a hash, it's just a piece of code that has a value of thousands of dollars. But the base of it is the trust of thousands of people that have led to think that, oh, this is going to be the future of currency.
So we give the value.
So we, as the audience, and we as the storytellers and the writers, we give the value, and then we trust the story and we give the meaning to it, and we put our money where our mouth is, basically. In this case, literally.
Does the evolving audience, is that what ends up changing the way the story is told, perhaps?
I think so.
In most way, it is.
Yeah.
Like, you think about 25 years ago, when computers were almost not a thing, and people were looking at, I don't know if Bitcoin was a thing, I haven't fact checked this, but if it were a thing, it was really, really hard to actually trust it because there was not enough backing to do it. But now people are looking at it, how it has such a high prospect. But again, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was something that was not looked at. It was something that was left out of most stories.
But is that because the audience is evolving, or is that because the audience become the storytellers? Do you know what I mean? Like the people, suddenly as more and more people start to listen to that story of Bitcoin, they in turn, sort of like the oral tradition, they become the storytellers, which creates momentum and excitement, and then
they buy into the story.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So could we say that again? Could we say that storytelling is just a way to get to someone's values? It's just a way to get to someone's sensitivity. That seems so cheesy, but it's actually true.
But
it's actually true that sensitivity is what, at the end of the day, guides us. That's what gives us a purpose. That's what gives us a reason to wake up in the morning. You wake up in the morning because you want to go to class. And why do you want to go to class? Because the idea of getting called out for skipping class strikes a chord in you, right?
Yeah.
So I think no matter how cheesy it might seem, it could actually be that.
Mr. Park, is that what you were getting at before when you said that stories humanize us, or they humanize a message? That they get at our values?
I think so, and I think also that communities and societies, which a lot of the human sciences obviously address, all the human sciences address, you have a communal narrative, and then I think to be part of the community, you have to buy in. Because you see people who have alternative narratives often get rejected by society. And then sometimes, from a historical perspective, they look back and go, ooh, really, the narrative should have shifted that way, but because of sort of groupthink, sheeple, that wasn't accepted at the time. So as a result, you say, oh, that person was actually a brilliant thinker and could have changed the course, but was rejected. And I think you even see that now with contemporary people. Someone's like, with the debate that goes on, Elon Musk, is he insane, or is he really pointing us in the future, the direction we should go in? In order to continue to advance as a society, and again, that's loaded too. Like, what does advancement mean?
Yeah.
As we we're nearing the end of our time, and I thank everyone for it. I do have a final question that I want to give to the audience, give to the panel, that came up from this discussion actually. Max, you're talking about how the kind of stories that human scientists tell in economics, they're how an example of how this business went from one thing to the other, or how a statistician uses stats to show that this happened, or how Bitcoin developed over time. And we also talked about in geography, climate change, and the story of what that is and how what's going to happen in the future and where it came from, that being a story. I want to ask, in those contexts, is every story in human sciences a kind of history? Or is there a purely human science story that can be told that isn't history?
Well, can you say that again?
It sounds like every story that we had as an example of a story in human science was technically history. Like climate change, this is what happened, and this is how we got here. In this business, this is what happened with it. Like, is there a kind of story a human scientist can tell that's not history?
Well, which is kind of reconnecting to the idea that history, as I like to think of history as the same way I think of philosophy. I don't like to think of it as an A-OK. I more like to think like we do take history classes, but then we take history of mathematics classes, and then we take history of science classes, and then we take history of... So I think history, just like philosophy, is more of a way to approach knowledge more than knowledge itself.
And also the fact that if you don't go into the past, you could say that you go into the future. You project. Like, again, this part of this story that I was telling about Bitcoin, in the end, it was mostly projection. It was a prediction. It was me saying, "Hey, I'm gonna put my money here because I think that this in 10 years is gonna be huge."
There's that element of imagination, right?
Yeah, a little bit of imagination and vision about what's gonna be or what could be. And again, if you're not looking into the past or maybe basing yourself in the past, that's the way you go. You go forth.
So that's interesting to think about. So if that is in the realm of economics and you're projecting to the future with creativity, is that history? So that's this is what you're asking.
Historians also do that, right?
Yeah.
They also use past events to predict future.
Yeah, which is again drawing analogies
pattern.
to apply concepts. You know that communism tends to authoritarianism, right? That's you get that through history, but again, that's probably history of politics. Is history really a subject? Is history just a way of approaching things?
Honestly,
I have a friend who his father is a futurist, and that's how he makes his living. Very, very successfully, I might add. And companies all over the world hire him because he studies patterns, to go back to that, and he looks for the connections, and then he makes projections, and they pay him for his projections. And the reason they pay him so much is because he's much more often correct than
Sounds
he's
like
incorrect.
a hedge fund. No.
Yeah, but my question
Very
to you,
dystopian.
I would never look at him, and maybe I should, and go, "Oh, this guy's a historian." Even though he, of course, is right. Even though he's studying patterns to figure out, how to get to that point.
And you just communicated that to us by telling us that story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. That was a great panel. I appreciate everyone taking their time today. I think we got to some of the big questions, and one of the nice things about the way this one's worded, and a good tip for any people that might be writing this essay, is it does actually say discuss, not examine. So you don't actually have to come to big conclusions about this. You have to explore the concepts and think about them from different perspectives. So I think we did a lot of that today. Thank you once again, everybody, and thank you, our team, for recorders.
Thank you.
Cut.